Hello everyone, welcome to this webinar organized by the ALLFORPACK exhibition. On the theme PPWR, Separating Fact from Fiction, I am delighted to host this webinar. So, Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation is the full title of this famous regulation that is causing confusion among all the players in the packaging world. Adopted last December by the European Council, this regulation is intended to revolutionize packaging practices after an adaptation phase that ends in June 2026. And with me to discuss this, I have the pleasure of having Lise and Nicolas and Enzo Muttini, co-founders of Monsieur et Madame Recyclage. So Monsieur et Madame Recyclage is an environmental engineering consultancy. Both are expert engineers in the field of recycling, but also in reuse. They are particularly skilled in educating on the subject. There is no doubt they will help you gain a clearer understanding. Hello to both of you.
Hello.
I also have with me Chantal de Lamotte, who is the director of the ALLFORPACK Packaging Fair in Paris. Hello, Chantal.
Hello, Claire. Hello, everyone.
So during these 45 minutes, our speakers will share their definition of the regulation on packaging and packaging waste. We will revisit the objectives. And then we will address 11 key themes as well as the timeline and deadlines to consider in order to prepare for the compliance. Before diving into the heart of the matter, Chantal, I have a first question for you. Why did you choose to highlight the theme of PPWR to start this new series of webinars organized by the ALLFORPACK exhibition?
I think our webinars always follow on from the events we regularly hold to regular manner to provide information to the entire packaging community and stakeholders in regular manner possible. So today, packaging is encountered at all levels of the industry and is in the spotlight. It's a current topic that faces many challenges to overcome. And then during our recent edition, we saw that the on-site conferences highlighted real ongoing issues with the effective deployment of the PPWR regulation, both for the manufacturers who were well acquainted with the French JEC law and all the European manufacturers. In fact, today, the entire European Union is being standardized by the regulation. And it is therefore naturally that this theme appeared important to us to initiate this new series of conferences before ALLFORPACK EMBALLAGE Paris 2026.
So it's true, this is a regulation on which there has been reflection, things evolving. So it's also indeed the time, the means, I would say, to take stock of this legislative and regulatory framework.
Absolutely. We are delighted to welcome Mr. and Mrs. Recycling with a really big rule over 124 pages long. And I think our audience has encountered difficulties in perhaps finding a summary of it. That's indeed somewhat the purpose of this webinar.
I propose that we dive right into the heart of the matter. Lise, can you briefly remind us what the PPWR is, the European regulation that was adopted on December 19th, 2024?
That's right. It was adopted on December 19th, 2024. So it's the European regulation specifically on packaging and packaging waste, which was officially published on January 22nd, 2025, and incorporates the directive from 1994 and is in line with the SUP directive. It's really, in fact, a document that's actually quite a bit, indeed, somewhat difficult to read. There are 124 pages, as you mentioned, and we took the time to thoroughly analyze everything and actually make a summary to simplify it a bit. Because it's true that there have been back and forth also at the level of the regulations over the past few years.
What are the main objectives, Enzo, and especially which packaging is affected?
So what's key is that we address all packaging in the same way as the extension of references that we can find in France, whether it's household packaging, but also professional packaging, in fact, whether it's for food, cosmetics, transport, grouping, etc. What is important to remember is that the aim of this regulation is really to target the 3 Rs, so reduction, reuse, recycling. And with a strong focus on reuse, which we didn't necessarily have until now. And a well-defined framework for everything related to biodegradation.
And a real desire to truly harmonize across all member countries.
So, Lisa, there are still some clarifications to be made regarding all this ecosystem and these objectives?
Absolutely. So what really needs to be remembered is that the PPWR will not override all the laws, in fact, all the latest regulations that have been implemented in France. It really serves as the minimum baseline for all European countries. And the countries that go further, well, that's great. Like some regulations in France, they go further. That doesn't mean that we will go backwards. We will keep all the regulations that go further than the PPWR on French territory.
Very well. So I suggest that now, since we've just outlined the PPWR and its scope, we look together at the key themes to keep in mind to implement this compliance. Then Lise, or actually Enzo, the first of them concerns waste prevention. Is it really the best way to minimize the impact on the environment?
Well, that's obvious. Each class of material still uses fossil resources, whether it's gas for cardboard, gas for glass, for steels, for aluminum, oil for plastic, and gas for plastic, and coal for plastic. So obviously we will have major reduction targets. It's important. What you need to know is that this is true for all member states. It doesn't necessarily concern brands directly in the sense that it's really at the state level to organize this so quickly. In fact, there are reduction targets, 5% by 2030, 10% by 2035, and 15% by 2040. The idea is that by the end of 2040, in absolute terms, we will have almost a 40% reduction. Here, you need to visualize your packaging bin at home. In fact, by 2040, it should actually be approximately half as full when I take it out.
Okay, that's a good indicator. So we just looked at waste prevention. The second theme concerns recycling. What is ultimately the goal and the key dates to remember?
So here, it's the same. These are objectives more at the level of member states that you will find, let's say, mainly directed by eco-organizations. You should know that it's by material class with objectives for 2026 and objectives for 2030. In France, some areas are on track and others where we are not at all. So obviously with plastics, it's struggling. With aluminum, particularly with cans, it will need to be monitored. However, for corrugated cardboard, it's on track, no issue.
And regarding reuse and biodegradation?
Thank you for asking the question. So actually, the only thing is that in these objectives, we can have up to 5% of the objective is deducted in relation to what we could claim in terms of reuse. So I have 5% of packaging that is reused in my market, or what would be the case in biodegradation. We shouldn't rely too much on biodegradation, come back to it just afterwards. But so reuse could be part of it.
And what is also important to note is that indeed the calculations will really be done at the entrance of the recycling center and no longer at the entrance of sorting centers, as I've seen for certain materials until now.
Very well. So what we can take away from this is really 65% use of all packaging waste before 2026 and 70% in 2030. We are now on the third theme. And here we are going to talk about recyclability. And it includes a classification, this recyclability. Can you tell us about it?
Yes, so that's important. So basically, there will really be an ABC classification across all member states of Europe. So we have the class we call D, which is actually neither in A nor in B nor in C, which will be banned from 2030. And everything that will be categorized as C will be banned in 2038. So the idea is really to say we are going to do eco-design with a view to recycling because that's what will enable proper recycling. There is obviously a criterion of recyclability on an economically viable scale in a territory in an industrial way that will come into effect in 2035. This is very important because until today, in the way we determine recyclability, it wasn't necessarily well taken into account. Obviously, the adjustments in the rules for eco-contributions are clearly will incorporate this classification and change depending on whether it's A or B and C before 2038.
So among this classification, can you tell us which packaging is specifically concerned by these categories?
Well, it's for all the packaging that is put on the market. Like, the most important thing is, of course, there will be exceptions. What you need to remember is that we are dealing with this ABC classification, which primarily depends on the weight. In fact, the weight of the main material, and it really applies to all packaging.
All right. And then from a materials perspective, what about those whose materials have no viable recycling stream? And what is ultimately the role of the eco-organizations?
Well, the role of the eco-organizations is primarily to clearly explain to all, in a way that is easy to understand, their members how it works, particularly the rules regarding weight. In fact, similar to what was done until now with guidelines on recyclability, but except that now it will be harmonized across all countries. There are two important things to remember, which are, until now, there was a bit of ambiguity on how to calculate a weight, whether the adhesives, glues in calculations, if you have a plastic layer that serves as a barrier in your packaging, it is considered a composite material. It is indeed taken into account. So it's key to remember that. This means that, for example, a complex package with multiple materials, including the main material, is below 80% of the packaging's mass, will be in Class C and will be banned by 2030.
We really have this notion that is truly redefined in PPWR between recyclable and recycled. So we will indeed really have the ability to classify as recyclable only if there is a large-scale recycling solution that is economically viable, as Enzo mentioned before, and that exists in the region. So it's really the difference between theory and practice that it is actually recycled in practice.
Perfect. I now propose, if you agree, to talk about the fourth theme, which is about the integration of recycled materials. How do we navigate this by type of packaging ultimately?
So obviously, if we definitely want to promote recycling, we must mandate the integration of recycled materials, the core. This is something we advocate for a lot in France. This is already the case for PET, for food contact, particularly for bottles. So here, the regulation just reinforces this for all member states. What is a bit subtle is that, of course, it is quite detailed. So we first have targets for 2030, targets for 2040, and these targets, in fact, they are sub-targeted for those who are sensitive to food contact, for those who are not sensitive to food contact, and for other plastics. So in theory, what does that mean? It means that, for example, by 2030, we would be required to incorporate 35% of recycled polypropylene in a polypropylene package. Of course, there will be exemptions. And by 2040, set a very specific target only for bottles that have 65% of recycled PET in PET bottles. So these are really measures that just support the existing laws, or even that are even more ambitious. The key point to remember is that depending on the recycling rate, the integration of recycled materials in the rest of the sector, in packaging, etc., the European Commission reserves the right to say in 2032 we will duplicate these objectives that are currently focused on plastic packaging to glass and aluminum. So it's not impossible that tomorrow we might have similar objectives for other classes of materials. What should be noted is that when we say plastic, in fact, it actually means polymer plus additive. Obviously, everything that is paper and cardboard is essentially based on cellulose and additives. And since cellulose is a polymer, it is clearly specified in the regulation that we
are not. That's what I was going to ask you. It's not always easy to find your way sometimes. Is all of this clearly specified?
So it is specified in black and white. Paper and cardboard do not fall under the designation plastic. Be cautious. If there is a plastic layer, it is considered a composite. So a cardboard cup that is waterproof and sold as plastic-free with a layer of acrylic-type polymer. In fact, it falls under the designation of a composite with a plastic layer.
Very well.
And the last thing is that we will obviously and clearly have certain criteria for the durability of recycling technologies. The idea is not to say we will force brands to use recycled material even if it is harmful to nature. Obviously, there will be a whole scientific effort to validate the different technologies of recycling by material and by type of waste. Currently exists at the EU level for what has already been done. There is nothing worse than incineration in terms of greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to global warming.
Very well. Are there any exemptions, Enzo?
Well, there are quite a few in the entire regulation. Laugh, I'm glad I asked the question.
Laugh.
No. So everything that is, in fact, we will go very quickly. So obviously, if you need to understand whether your packaging is within the exemptions, the idea is to search for keywords directly in the regulation. We encourage you to read it, but read it quickly using Control F, Command F, for example. You can hesitate to reach out to us if you need to clarify. So everything that is a bit, let's say, for medical purposes, devices for feeding infants, etc., this is obviously exempt from the obligations of integrating recycled materials. everything related to food contact. So here it's important what I mentioned earlier. We have, for example, 35% recycled polypropylene to be integrated mandatorily. Well, actually, if we are not able to technically validate the food contact suitability of certain grades of plastic specifically, they will be automatically exempted. We cannot ask brands to validate both the health regulations and the PPWR regulations. So there is one last point, which is that the Commission will evaluate before 2028 the interest in having bioplastics. That is to say, will I be required to include 35% tomorrow? Or can I actually say I have 20% recycled materials and 15% bio-based materials?
Enzo said bioplastic, but he means bio-based plastic. Bioplastic is a short term.
A quick example, but today we can make PET with a bio-based fraction, a fraction from the recycling of different recycling technologies. It's the same for PE. What you need to know is that in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, it's very interesting to have bio-based materials. But for other pollution indicators like soil acidification, this is not necessarily beneficial. I changed the entire global production of polyethylene to polyethylene derived from sugarcane. I will face major environmental scandals that will arise on other pollution indicators than greenhouse gases.
Of course, these percentages might be reassessed if we realize that as a result there is no enough. We're not able to produce enough recycled materials to reintegrate them. And so the Commission reserves the right to adjust these percentages up or down based on the results.
Very well. We will now address the fifth topic, that of bioplastics. Why is biodegradability not exactly part of the 3 Rs?
There you go. So what you need to remember is that the main product of biodegradation through composting is carbon dioxide, and through methanization, it's methane. These are 2 gases responsible for climate change. And so even though it seems virtuous to say I have something that will be assimilated, recycled by nature, in terms of waste management, it works, but in terms of decarbonization strategies for energy sovereignty, it's not necessarily relevant. So today, like, PPWR delivers a very clear message, which is to say that the biodegradability of packaging is acceptable for ultra-restricted, ultra-targeted applications. And so, in fact, we have a number of constraints that are written in black and white. We must be in a situation where reuse is impossible. It must be proven technically and scientifically through composting and methanization. So here I'll give you a very quick example. PLA, which is polylactic acid, often derived from corn, for example. So from sugarcane that can be found in bottles, equivalent to PET. Like if I put that in industrial composting, that's fine. If I put that in a methanization unit, it releases oxygen, which depletes the colonies of bacteria that contribute to the proper assimilation of the material. So it's counterproductive. So for example, it wouldn't meet the criteria for both composting and methanization. It needs to be disposed of with organic waste, help improve source sorting. So for example, small bags that allow for sorting organic waste, why not? The tea bag, why not? There must be no contamination of the organic waste, and there must be no contamination of the streams going to recycling. Take the example of my PLA bottle. If the bottle ends up in a PET stream, it contaminates the PET stream. So here we have very, very clear restrictions. It's for ultra-targeted applications. It definitely won't be part of a major deposit strategy. Absolutely not.
We have covered everything that is recycled materials, but also bioplastics. The sixth theme is, of course, as you might expect, about the process of reduction, which we naturally need to consider. I want to say because there are ultimately many excessive packages. We also need to keep in mind key dates, but also standards. Who wants to respond?
Yes, there are indeed certainly reduction targets being implemented. So by 2028, sales packaging must be designed to minimize weight and volume. So, and in 2030, limiting empty space to 50%. This will significantly affect everything related to logistics for delivery. So everything concerning commerce and transportation. And grouping packs. In 2032, the Commission may extend this requirement to toy packaging, cosmetics, DIY kits, and electronic products. We're focusing on everything related to transportation and e-commerce. The aim is to reduce packaging in and other materials as possible.
There is an important point, which is to say that there is what we call the presumption of conformity. It's somewhat similar to the presumption of innocence in legal terms, meaning that as long as we are not able to provide the burden of proof that a brand has not done the efforts to reduce, that marketer is considered compliant by default. It must be, for example, the DGCCRF that comes with evidence of measures with validated methodologies by the Commission to say that this packaging is not compliant. So the second thing that will really be important to remember is that, in fact, all these methods of calculation will be things that will be validated in 2028. In this regulation, there is a lot of work that we call non-legislative, meaning in a committee of experts and not at the level of the European Parliament Assembly. They are made to validate all the standards, the methods put in place, and that are later submitted to some of the institutions. Ongoing work, 2027, 2028, 2030, 2032, etc. So obviously all the specificities of the packaging world. The fact that recycled material must be integrated logistical concerns, hygiene needs, for example, protective gas. For this type of packaging where we will have inert packaging, will be included in the way calculations are made. We won't end up with vacuum-sealed packaging, gas-sealed packaging. Inert, where we could say there is an excessive amount of empty space. No, it might have been considered to say here, these are specific needs for hygiene, food preservation, etc. Factored in calculation.
If I may, because we received a question. For steel cans and the integration of recycled material, is it like aluminum perhaps? We are being asked.
So at the moment, just the obligations, I may not have been clear enough, and I apologize. The obligations for integrating recycled materials are essentially for plastic packaging. Okay, it is only for plastic packaging, with potentially something similar in 2032, depending on what the Commission decides, for aluminum and glass. So steel packaging, paper, cardboard packaging for the moment are not concerned.
All right. I am also being asked, you mentioned cellulose. Is cellulose considered a plastic polymer or as paper, cardboard?
There you go. So this question is central. It is written in black and white in this European regulation that anything that is paper, cardboard based on cellulose is not considered as plastic. We do not fall under the definition of plastic polymer plus additive.
All right. Another question, and then we'll move on to the rest of our topics. A complex aluminum PE cap is currently being considered as aluminum if the weight of the aluminum is more than 50% of the cap. Will it now be considered as complex?
So there you go. So today, you obviously have guidelines from the eco-organizations, especially from CITEO, on how to say this packaging falls into this material class. This obviously in relation to recyclability goals and the ABC separation, it will not fit in. That is to say, if you are only at 60%, let's say, of PETA, for example, it will fall into the category that will be banned quite soon. It will be necessary to increase to 70% and 80% of the main material. And the way of counting will be based on the main material. What will not be taken into account is everything that will be below 5%. For example, minor components, I think of glue and ink. So ink, glue and adhesive. But once again, I remind you, be careful not to try to fit everything into the adhesive and ink category. Adhesive and ink. There are layers that act as a barrier. These are layers that function as barriers. They are layers. Glue, inks.
Very well. I'll take one last one because it's interesting. Does this regulation concern the packaging of raw materials purchased by industries for production, industries to produce, or does it only concern packaging for products sold exactly to consumers?
It's indeed both. It's indeed both. The regulation concerns both primary and secondary packaging in terms of compliance. Secondary packaging.
With, of course, regulatory constraints on recyclability, the integration of recycled materials, reuse, and research, which will depend on the sector.
All right, so I suggest we perhaps move on to the seventh theme. It is actually one of the 3 R's, which is reuse. And here we have 3 key dates to keep in mind, but really, there you go. Can you first tell us about this reuse?
Before moving forward with the themes, we will go back a little to reduction.
Yes, reduction, sorry.
It is important to specify, therefore, regarding the reduction of unnecessary packaging, that consequently, marketing will no longer justify the excess weight or volume of packaging. Okay. There will be some exemptions, but there will also be a ban on double-walled packaging that will prohibit, which allows increasing the perceived volume.
Wait, let me just interrupt you. This is really important because it means, for example, you want to market a high quality, elegantly designed glass wine bottle with the logo embossed in glass on the bottle. That increases the volume. If it's not a brand that was already registered before the regulation was recorded, or rather published in the official journal of the European Union, you will no longer be allowed to do that officially. It's really a strong point. It's really writing in black and white the phrase here, marketing does not justify an excess weight of volume. Everything related to appellations, or rather everything related to protected geographical indication, obviously is exempt to preserve the specificity of being able to clearly recognize the brands in relation to their terroir, etc.
And there is also a whole list of bans on single-use plastic packaging. So we have packaging for unprepared fruits and vegetables weighing less than 1.5 kilos. We have on-site catering packaging, as we have already seen being developed in France, deployed in France, co-packing packaging.
This is new, it's important. This means that today we are not allowed to use single-use plastic. We will no longer be allowed to use single-use plastic for co-packing.
And for all individual portions, for hotels, restaurants, and cafes such as...
Knowing that it really is single-use plastic. So here, in fact, it somewhat reiterates what had already been proposed by the directive and what has already been transposed into French law. It just reinforces it. If tomorrow you put an individual sugar packet, but it's made of paper, cardboard, and there's just a micro layer of adhesive at the seams, it does not fall bans. If the packet is made of plastic, it's under the ban. So the only thing we can invite you to do is to check only the Annex 5. You are not required to read the entire regulation, but to check whether your packaging can fall under all the prohibitions, or to make use of our services, of course.
Very well. Thank you for these clarifications on the reduction. Can we talk about reuse?
So here, a big change, reuse as a very important lever for reducing packaging waste across all sectors. We have three major sectors. We obviously have the sector of service and hospitality. So it's the same. There was already a part of the laws that had already been transposed into French law. This just supports or details them. So by 2027, there will be an obligation to accept containers for takeaway sales that consumers would bring back. In France, this happens. The only thing is that this will be true for all the countries of the European Union. What is interesting with this regulation is most of the things already implemented in France ultimately are made profitable through harmonization in all the other countries. By 2028, the obligation to offer as a catering unit packaging reusable, and by 2030, the obligation to have 10% of takeaway sales that are in reusable packaging, with the prohibition of using single-use plastic on site. So there may certainly be ways to
cheat a little. For example, in the Netherlands today, you already have this type
of obligations. For example, you might take a tea with small tapioca pearls in a thermosealed plastic cup. In fact, the store sells you the disposable thermosealed cup and the same cup non-thermosealed as a reusable alternative that you can use at home. That won't work. That won't work. Why? Because in reuse, we might come back to this later, there are a certain number of constraints to say that it is part of a reuse loop, a reuse system with a reuse operator. And so the tactic of saying, I sell the same packaging, the customer choosing it to reuse it or not, that won't be possible as it is today in the Netherlands.
Very well. What about in the end, ultimately, in the final analysis regarding beverages, especially transportation?
Today, the big change for large retail chains is the targets for beverages. So 10% by 2030, 40% by 2040 of reuse on sales units. There are exemptions, so everything that will be milk, dairy products, and very perishable beverages. So very perishable beverage in the sense of the regulation or directive, I don't recall, 1169 on foodstuffs. So if you already know that your product was perishable, it means it falls under this category. If you don't know, it probably isn't in this category, you'd have discussed it. There are obviously exemptions also for distributors in very low density cities to avoid penalizing them with additional costs linked to reuse loops of logistical systems that are super expensive for a few packagings. For artisans, microbreweries, small productions, micro enterprises, those who produce less than a ton per year, there is obviously an exemption from reuse targets. There is something interesting, which is the groups between brands, between distributors. So you must not have more than 40% of the market. or it must not involve more than 5 distributors. Knowing that for these groups, there will be some clarifications on how to organize and communicate the information by 2028. This is very interesting. It means that if your brand already has distributors on which you are at 80% reuse and others you're only at 10% reuse, if they are in the same group and in terms of sales volume, you manage by example to 80% compared to your sales volume. We can actually average it out. You don't have to have 40% of your entire network in 2040 distribution.
So there's another point as well, Enzo, which is the PPWR. It specifies that reusable packaging is sent for reconditioning and does not become waste. Their design is typically established for a maximum number of reuses. Can you tell us about it?
That's what we were saying. There are a certain number of constraints. So a reusable packaging means that it is designed for a certain number of reuses maximum. There is obviously a reuse operator. So all of this is detailed in Annex 6 of the regulation. It's the same. If you're interested, you can go directly and take a look at Annex 6.
Okay.
And so it's a clear governance, equitable access for all economic operators. We cannot discriminate one brand over another, with very clear rules on which packaging is allowed, which are the products that will be packaged, how they are handled, how they are collected, how they are stored in the room cleanly, etc., how they are refilled. So the reuse operator must obviously apply these clear rules, and it is necessary that the information is accessible to everyone. There is obviously a supply chain that must be properly followed with cleaning, the repair, sanitary use control, etc. That's why I was telling you the tactic of the disposable alternative, and I just say that the customer chooses will not work because it has to be within a reuse system. And this reuse system has constraints that are very clear, black and white in PPWR.
I would like to go back a little in the presentation because we have gone through the entire reuse part for transportation, whereas in reality, there are indeed very strong reuse targets. So we are looking at 40% by 2030, 70% by 2040, with exemptions, of course, as in all areas except for hazardous goods and goods that are large or custom made, except for cardboard boxes and flexible plastic in contact with food. But transport be truly impacted by these reuse obligations.
Knowing there are already well-established players deployed on an industrial scale, factories wash more than 400,000 packages per day. So this is something that ultimately just validates a model that is already well-established. There you go. The same applies to grouping packages. That means you are a distributor, you receive lots by the 1,000 and you redistribute them by 100. You are responsible via the professional packaging EPR or directly the household EPR if it's for consumer distribution. For those specific grouping packages. And so there are targets of 10% reuse by 2030 and 25% by 2040. Cardboard boxes are exempt. Knowing that on B2B schemes, from industrial site to industrial site, with very clear logistical schemes, there are quickly economic gains to be made by switching to reuse.
Very well. Can we now talk about the 8th point, or would you like to revisit the topic of reuse?
We always thought a bit about recharging.
I do have another question. We had a small clarification regarding the article. The obligation for reuse is not applicable to the same economic operators in 2030 and 2040 for beverage distributors in 2030 and economic operators in 2040.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification.
So regarding recharging, you should know that by 2030, 10% of sales areas will be dedicated to recharging.
So for the French market, in fact, these are mainly points that have just been pushed by the Vrac and Ruse network for PPWR. So it's not as if it's really new, but just everything that was deployed to be copy-pasted in other countries, these were not obligations. So in fact, we find the same rules. So I suggest we don't go over it in detail again. There are labeling rules, information rules, etc. Obviously, the key point to remember is that from the moment it's bulk refilling, as a brand, you are no longer responsible for what may happen once it has been filled by the consumer.
All right. So on the refill part, we are then indeed in 2028, we will have the labeling that will be harmonized for sorting with the help of notably pictograms.
So that's the big point. The important big point is that we will obviously have harmonized labeling finally across all the countries of the European Union. That doesn't mean that everything is to be thrown away. It might be something that is quite similar. It just means that once again, it will be necessary to readjust the printing on the packaging and manage the stocks of already printed packaging. And this will come by 2028, so it will be well detailed. I should mention that there are a number of French bodies that are well represented in all the committees of expertise for all these subjects, and therefore a number of French interests in the industrial sector should be properly defended in these bodies. The only thing I would add before we move on is that this is really sorting with a view to recycling. So for example, the bio-based content, the integration of recycled materials such as plastics and metals will not be identified with a standardized pictogram. This is really sorting for consumers with a view to recycling.
Very well. We can move on to our 10th point. Lise, Enzo?
So the instruction for recycling that has proven effective in a number of countries to increase the rate of collection of proper packaging for recycling. So for the moment, it will actually depend on whether by 2029 the collection rate is reached or not for plastic bottles and cans only, such as. So will this rate potentially be at 90%? Is it already at 90% in terms of collection? Will it perhaps reach 90% in the coming years? Or are we, as a member state, required to impose a deposit for recycling? There has been a bit of buzz on LinkedIn in recent days about reports from ADEME that have not been published, which tend to show that the rates will likely not be reached and that we will have to impose a deposit for recycling on local authorities. And it's something that at the moment is a somewhat hot political topic. And here we would indeed finally have the end of this play. So this is important to remember, that we will be forced to increase the rates of collection.
And there are also exemptions, it seems to me. Can you also tell us about the deposit systems?
So there are always exemptions, so everything that will be wine products and similar, spirits, milk, and dairy products. But it is the member states that have the right to agree on these exemptions. To contravene, yes. And then, if necessary, containers of less than 10 centiliters. The states whose separate collection rate is above 80% in 2026 are those who think they will reach 90% before 2028. In fact, with the deposit system, what really needs to be remembered is that PPWR really provides a framework, and then it's up to the member states to facilitate the return of the framework and the deposit at the cross-border level.
Very well.
And then obviously, as with reuse, a clear deposit operator that guarantees fair access, etc. With a certain number of rules, we invite you to read Annex 10.
Perfect. Can we now talk about compliance? I think there are especially notable new documentations to precisely and additionally achieve that.
So regardless of whether it's about the integration of recycled materials, the different classes of recyclability, reuse, refilling, etc., etc., on reduction, excessive volumes, etc., etc., etc. The CE marking does not serve as compliance. So you have an important EU declaration to fill out, a technical documentation to associate with the packaging. So you can find everything in Annex 7. So what you need to do is actually understand in your sector, for the packaging you put on the market, what are all the regulations that constrain you? And regarding that, what is the technical documentation to complete? So we have descriptions, technical drawings, complete lists of standards and common specifications, the qualitative description of assessments for recycling, the reduction, reuse, etc., etc. So there, we must wait to get help from the eco-organizations that provide additional support. It will help to properly frame this. What you need to remember is that, in fact, something is going to happen. It's the digital passport associated with packaging. You will have a QR code or any other data collection system that will be directly on the packaging. So if you think your labels were already quite overloaded, you have to make a little more space. And in fact, this technical documentation will be accessible via the QR code on the packaging directly. So they must be kept available, of course, 5 years for disposable, 10 years for reusable. The allocation of the different lots of packaging products must be referenced there. There is the possibility of going through a representative, whether it's an online sales platform, a large distributor, an eco-organization, etc. There, it will be necessary to see by sector, by supply chain, what suits everyone the best. And obviously, in fact, a company that does refurbishing will be considered as a producer in relation to what it refurbishes.
Very well. Do you wish to bring up any other points on conformity assessment, or can we answer a few questions?
Well, let's say one last thing, I think, is that there are obviously a lot of things that are correctly specified. There are certain sanctions, legal sanctions, that are inevitable and will have to come, or rather that will have to be detailed by 2027. So for the moment, we don't yet know exactly who controls what. We can obviously expect it to be, in principle, the DGCCRF, but it could very well be a ministry that commissions ADEME, which commissions third-party certification institutes to verify. Well, there you go. There will potentially be legal fines, 75,000 euros, 2 or 3 years of imprisonment for those who would be in violation of this regulation. But that's not necessarily the most important thing. The most important thing is the access to transparency via QR codes, and any NGO a bit focused on zero waste can be in a position to verify and create a buzz, or even file a complaint, as there will be a lot of methodologies on overpackaging. There will be precise methodologies to measure properly. This means that tomorrow, if it has to go to the legal level, it will be much easier to precisely determine that a certain brand or market player is not compliant and that a certain NGO was right.
It's true that in PPWR there is a real intention for reuse and reduction, but also for transparency. And as a result, this transparency will also allow for regulation through NGOs and associations, which will be able to directly file complaints, even though we don't yet know how this will be organized at the level of compliance control.
Perfect. I suggest we answer a few questions before discussing the timeline, as well as upcoming deadlines to come. We have a question about the recycling rate of aluminum. You mentioned that we need to monitor cans, but they have an average recycling rate in Europe of 70%. So should France reconsider its collection method? What about other aluminum packaging and their recycling rates?
Well, so actually, regardless of the average rate at the European level, the rates are applied by different member states. And so if we are below in France, then we need to see, do we not have obligations to integrate recycled materials? Do we not have a recycling deposit system being implemented by 2029? In fact, it's a bit delicate because, if you will, these are very sensitive points on the political level, because it directly involves local authorities, the revenues of local authorities, the organization of waste management over the last 10 or 20 years. We know what the final goal is. Today, we cannot assert, well, we do not provide very precise answers, except to tell you we might know more in a year and a half.
Very well. Another question. For these weight reduction goals, the incorporation of recycled materials in packaging and of reuse, are there incentive mechanisms, financial bonuses or penalties? Can they be implemented by the EPR in France in any way? Planned by PPWR for plastic manufacturers and recyclers? By the regulatory deadlines? What happens if we do not meet these objectives while new technologies emerge and make them achievable?
So obviously, in fact, everything related to modulation is more or less left free for the member states to decide, and sovereign how they want to frame this for the eco-organizations within their member states. With, obviously, as we have specified, there are still things that will be mandatory. Well, it's mandatory, for example, on recycling classes. We know it will change. In fact, here it is important to understand that this goes in the direction of what has already been implemented, and that we can expect to have modulations in relation to reuse, in relation to recharging, everything that is part of the 3 Rs finally. This is not being questioned at all. It was already in the directive before. It's in the regulation. It was in previous laws. It's just about pushing further and further with a bit of freedom for the member states and the eco-organizations within the member states to structure all this with their market operators.
So there are many questions. I think we just won't be able to answer everything, but I'll try to cover a little the different questions by category. There is a rather concrete one, which is whether a refillable cosmetic jar with a cap, removable, will fit within the framework of double-walled packaging.
Yes, well, I think that will be a very good question. And there you have it. These are the joys of PPWR when we get into the details. Basically, what will really be prohibited today is the double wall with the intent to deceive the consumer on the capacity. Unless it is solely for the purpose of allowing refills, I think that will be allowed. Yes, it will be allowed. It goes without saying.
All right. There's another question, because regarding this ban on double walls, I'm being asked if it would, for example, prohibit cups with double walls that prevent the consumer from burning their fingers with a very hot drink.
Exactly. Basically, what needs to be understood is that the way the text is currently created, it does not cover every single case by case, where it would be written in black and white what needs to be done. So here it's about legal interpretation, and actually this legal interpretation needs to be done by the market introducer through specialized expert offices, through eco-organizations. In fact, it's going to be quite the role of eco-organizations to frame this. And obviously, depending on the potential bad buzz that could occur if an NGO gets involved. In the case of a cardboard cup, the goal has never been to deceive the consumer about the cup's capacity. Unless these are pre-sealed cups sold in deli sections, and the bottom of the cup is raised above the display. Here, it's really a feature that prevents burning your fingers, so it's quite different. We're really talking about packaging. For example, we've often seen it with ice cream containers.
Also with cosmetic bottles.
With certain cosmetic bottles. But well, ice cream, I think that's the best example. We have the lost bottom, the thief bottom. Here we need to see what fits inside. But again, this one is visible when you turn the packaging over. We're talking about things that will be double-walled, not necessarily physical.
We also ask about shampoo. The bottle will be prohibited if it's a bottle with dose distribution. That's it. It's, for example, the
disposable plastic single doses intended for the hospitality sector, they will be prohibited.
No, but in shampoos, we often see that, and it's particularly targeted by PPWR when you have the glass bottle, and inside the glass bottle you have a plastic pouch, and precisely where they put a huge glass jar to make you believe there's a lot of shampoo inside, when in fact the quantity is minimal. That is really targeted by the law.
Very well. There are many questions. We might discuss the timeline, because I think it's important for everyone to keep in mind the key dates.
So I would say quickly the questions, what needs to be well understood is that since we are dealing with a complex, dense piece of legislation with many subcategories, things that apply to some sectors and not to others, it's quite difficult to answer live with precision. We always need to take time to double check, etc. So if you don't know how to do it yourself, these are services we can provide with pleasure. Regarding the schedule, basically the most important thing is to remember the first and most important ban that comes into effect quite immediately, which is the ban on PFAS in packaging in contact with food. So anything that is based on eternal pollutants, meaning polymers where fluorine is integrated into the carbon chain. For example, takeaway or takeout packaging, such as for commercial restaurants, such as molded cellulose, slightly protected for fats, etc. Be very careful that in the packaging you buy, import, and put into the market, you don't have barrier functions provided by PFAS, because that will be prohibited. There are already NGOs on high alert who have already published reports like the one from Future Generations, who are conducting lab checks. It's not certain that by 2027, 2028, new reports won't be released, and that brands that haven't properly complied will be seriously penalized. And in this case, there is rather, let's say, a political consensus on the fact that we don't want PFAS in food packaging. So it'll be difficult to find a defense culinary. So that's what's really going to happen. After that, actually, the timeline is quite dense. So we have detailed everything. I think that in the email that will be sent back to all participants by ALLFORPACK, we will forward you the timeline. You have, for example, 2028. Well, the validation of the standard that aims to say this is A, B, or C in terms of recyclability.
In 2029, you will have the QR code, so the digital passport you mentioned on the packaging. What do we have that's interesting?
The bulk of the objectives comes in 2030 with all the recycling, reuse goals, etc.
It's an important date.
Yes, but there you go. Each time we have committees that aim to determine the relevance of what has been implemented for 2025, 2030, 2030, 2035, 2035, 2040. The idea is to say everything that for the moment is planned for 2040. There will obviously be evaluations to adapt or not the strategy, deploy other types of constraints on materials. So what was true for plastic, we do it for glass as well, or what was true in terms of recycling instructions. We also apply it to food cartons, for example, etc. We are not going to read everything to you. We obviously invite you to follow us on social media and to check the timeline that we
will send you by email. The timeline is already available on our LinkedIn page and on our website, but we will also send it to you by email following this webinar.
Perfect. Do you perhaps want to add a point about the schedule, the deadlines?
No, I think we should take some questions since we don't have much time left.
Let's move on to questions. Is there a specific text detailing all the bans on PFAS?
Good question. If I were to rephrase the question, it would be more like, what do we include in PFAS or what do we not include in PFAS? It seems to me that this is already detailed. And in this case, I don't know. In fact, if these questions interest you specifically, the best thing is to get closer to the interprofessional federations. For example, for plastics with Ellipso, don't hesitate to inquire with the IPC on all these questions. If you really want to know if you're dealing with PFAS or not, in reality, you just need to know if you have fluorine. In fact, it's about whether you have fluorine in the carbon chain.
So I have another question. You don't talk about labeling with the printing of a QR code that should mention the packaging elements of the product. Quite a few questions on the subject. QR code on all packaging or just on the cardboard? The PPWR also mentions more than just a QR code. It will also need to be written for those not equipped. Will we have to conduct a conformity assessment for packaging already on the market?
Well, there is this notion of presumption of conformity that comes up quite regularly in the text. So there maybe I couldn't tell you exactly for all the constraints where there is a presumption of conformity. The declaration of conformity must be made for all the packaging that you put on the market. For those currently available and already on the market, from the moment you put them back on the market annually, you will necessarily have to do it at one time or another. Regarding the QR code issue, we haven't gone into too much detail. It's still a bit unclear in the way it's framed. It just states a digital passport requiring a QR code with all the technical information, all the technical documentation for compliance accessible. In fact, these questions, what's tricky, what needs to be well understood is that there are still, for certain points, needs for very precise methodologies. And actually then at the level of the member states, it will be the member states who will decide, and then the eco-organizations will agree on how to frame it. Obviously, since it's a regulation to be harmonized, the idea is to have a digital passport that is harmonized globally. If we have an eco-organization in Italy that does something different from the eco groups in France or elsewhere, it will certainly be problematic. But right now we are somewhat unable to give you a very, very precise answer, except expect a digital passport and a QR code on each type of packaging.
So regarding the conformity assessment, does this obligation fall on the packaging manufacturers or perhaps on the marketers of finished products?
There you go. Obviously, we've skimmed over everything because, in fact, we would need to do a 3-hour webinar if we wanted to go into every little detail of each article. In the regulation, it is clearly written who is responsible for what, who is considered a producer, let's say a producer, packaging manufacturer, in terms of import, in terms of wholesaler, in terms of distributor, in terms of grouping. All of that is very, very structured, very specified. What must be kept in mind is that before being a European regulation, it was a directive from Europe. There are indeed new things, but in fact, the core of this text, that legal framework already existed. It had already been transposed into French law. So, for example, regarding all the rules about who is responsible for packaging, there is not a drastic change either. We simply include online commerce, grouping, etc., especially all the professional packaging. but the rules regarding import, export, online platforms, etc., those remain the same.
All right. Shall we perhaps take one last question? For reusable intersite transport packaging, I didn't understand the exemption for cardboard boxes. Are these exactly the transport cartons? And specifically, what about the wooden packaging?
So for the specific reuse targets that we have set forth on the objectives, transport or grouping packaging, basically everything that is boxes, corrugated cardboard, is exempt from the targets. This means that if you have a distribution system, B2B operates with corrugated cardboard, you don't need to constrain yourself with reuse targets. For wood, it definitely seems to me that if it's, in my opinion, wooden crates, you will be required to comply. Well, you will be required to adhere to a minimum of reuse targets.
Yes, I had the same memory about wooden crates.
Once again, what's complicated is that we really need to think it through. So here, either we invite you to read the PPWR or we call on you to use our services because it's difficult to answer off the top of one's head without making a legal error. The only thing we forgot to specify is everything related to wood, cork, ceramics for recyclability targets, such as on an industrial scale. There will be exemptions as long as it's 5% of the market placement on all categories of materials. So everything we said regarding recyclability targets, everything related to are excluded from those targets. We hadn't mentioned it before, but the question was about reuse targets, reuse.
Exactly. Well, thank you both. Please note that you can find more information on LinkedIn. And of course, as you might expect, Lise and Enzo will be available to answer any questions you might have. These questions at a more convenient later time. Chantal, I have one last question for you. What are the upcoming meetings and webinars of the exhibition that will take place, I remind you, from Nov 24, 26, 2026?
So we have many meetings planned for the end of 2025 and the year 2026. But first of all, we will meet on June 26th around the reuse of packaging from experimentation to industrial reality. Because as you all know, there is a major operation that has been conducted by Citeo on an updated reuse loop at a large scale across the entire west of France. And so with Go Réemploi, which is the operator of this operation, and so we invite you to come and discover all the facilities or complexities of this deployment on June 26th at 10 o'clock.
Well, the appointment is set, Chantal. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lise. And Enzo, for your very valuable insights. And thank you for being very numerous in participating in this webinar. See you soon.
See you.
Thank you. Goodbye.